The water was calm that morning, flat, brown, and still, the way the Zambezi gets when the rains have not yet come and the river sits low in its banks, heavy and patient like something waiting. The tourists had paid their money. They had climbed into the wooden motorboat at the dock, sunscreen already applied, cameras already out, the kind of easy excitement that comes with distance from danger. They had been told the rules: stay seated, keep hands inside the boat, do not make sudden loud noises, standard briefing. The kind of thing you half listen to while you are already scanning the waterline for movement, already imagining what you might see. Nobody was imagining what actually happened. If you have ever seen a hippopotamus in the wild, you know there is something deeply disorienting about it. The size does not fully register from photographs. In photographs, a hippo looks round and almost comical, like a cartoon version of an animal. In reality, standing in a flat-bottomed boat barely a meter above the surface of the water, a full-grown male hippopotamus emerging at speed from below the surface is not round, and it is not comical. It is the largest thing you have ever seen that is moving directly toward you, and it moves with a speed that your brain, educated entirely by wildlife documentaries and zoo visits, is completely unprepared for. The boat went over, and then the hippo stayed. 40 minutes. That is how long the survivors spent in the water. 40 minutes in a river system with one of the highest densities of hippopotamus and Nile crocodile on the African continent. 40 minutes while the animal that had flipped them held position nearby, surfacing and submerging, circling, returning. Not leaving, not charging again, at first. Just present, just there. And if you want to understand how something like that happens, and how the people in that water survived it, and what the science tells us about why hippos do what they do, then stay right here. Because this is one of the most extraordinary incidents of its kind ever recorded, and almost nobody outside the immediate community where it happened knows the full story. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes after this, because we are only getting started. The Zambezi River moves through southern Africa the way old things move, which is to say slowly but with absolute authority. It runs for more than 2,700 kilometers from its source in northwestern Zambia, east through Angola, along the borders of Botswana and Zimbabwe, through Mozambique, and finally into the Indian Ocean. Along the way, it creates the Victoria Falls, one of the largest waterfalls on Earth, and it fills and drains the Kariba Reservoir, one of the world's largest man-made lakes. But the section that concerns us here is neither of those famous stretches. It is the quieter water below the falls, the broad meandering lower Zambezi, where the river spreads itself across floodplains and sandbars, and the vegetation presses thick and green right down to the water's edge. This is hippo country, in the most complete sense of the phrase. The lower Zambezi and its tributaries support some of the highest concentrations of hippopotamus anywhere in Africa. And anywhere in Africa is saying something, because Africa holds virtually the entire global population of this animal. There are roughly 115,000 to 130,000 hippopotamus left on the continent. The number sounds substantial until you understand that less than 200 years ago, that number was many times higher, and that the hippo's range has contracted dramatically due to habitat loss and hunting for ivory, which in the hippo's case comes from its enormous lower canine teeth. But in the lower Zambezi, they are still numerous. You will see them in pods of 10, 20, sometimes 40 animals, the round backs like gray boulders just above the waterline, the ears twitching, the eyes and nostrils the only things fully exposed. They look like they are barely there, like the river itself has generated them out of sediment and patience. The tour boat on the day in question was not a large vessel. This is important to understand. Most of the wildlife viewing craft that operate on the river in this region are small open boats, fiberglass or wood, powered by modest outboard engines, carrying anywhere from 6 to 12 passengers plus a guide. They sit low in the water by design, partly for stability in the shallower channels, and partly because being low puts tourists closer to the surface, closer to the animals, closer to what they came to see. The irony of that design choice becomes apparent when you consider what happened. The guide was experienced. This matters too. He had been taking tourists on the river for years. He knew the pods. He knew the territorial males. He knew which stretches of water to avoid at certain times of day, and which channels the hippos preferred in the dry season. He was not a reckless man. He was not showing off. He had made the same journey dozens, perhaps hundreds of times, and the river had behaved itself. The group that morning included tourists from Europe and one family from South Africa who had come specifically for the wildlife experience. They had already seen elephant on the bank that morning, a small breeding herd moving through the riverine forest with that characteristic combination of great mass and great silence. They had seen a fish eagle spiral up from a dead tree and take something from the surface of the water in a brief explosion of white spray. They had drifted past a sandbank where Nile crocodiles lay so motionless they might have been rocks, mouths open, the pale pink of their palates visible from the boat. It had been a good morning. Everyone was relaxed. The guide had cut the engine, and they were drifting on a quiet stretch of the river, watching a small pod of hippos on the far bank. The animals were partially in the water, partially resting on the low muddy shelf at the river's edge. A cow and her calf were visible. 2 other animals nearby. The guide pointed them out, explained the group structure, explained how the females with young calves are often more dangerous than the territorial bulls because their protective instinct is so extreme. Standard interpretation. Good information. What nobody in the boat was watching was the water directly beneath them. The male came up from below. There is a behavior that researchers who study hippopotamus aggression have documented extensively, particularly in interactions between hippos and watercraft. It is called a submerged approach. The animal does not announce itself. It does not surface, assess the boat, and then charge across the open water in a visible rush that gives the occupants of the boat time to react, and the guide time to start the engine. Instead, the animal approaches underwater. Hippos can hold their breath for up to 5 minutes. They are extraordinarily agile beneath the surface for their mass, able to walk along the riverbed, push off from the bottom, and travel significant distances without surfacing. When a hippo executes a submerged approach on a small vessel, the first indication the people in that vessel have that anything is wrong is the moment of contact. The male in this case weighed, by the estimate of wildlife officials who later examined evidence at the scene and cross-referenced with known animals in the area, somewhere between 1,400 and 1,600 kilograms. That is roughly the weight of a small car. A compact sedan, the kind of thing you pass on the road every day without thinking about it. Now imagine that compact sedan coming up from directly beneath you, moving at speed, with its head tilted upward. The boat went airborne. Not dramatically, not the way it looks in the movies, not a slow-motion arc with people frozen in midair. It went over fast and hard, and the sound of it was apparently extraordinary. A combination of the impact of the animal on the hull, the cracking of fiberglass, and the immediate chaos of 12 people entering the water simultaneously. The guide later described it as like something detonating underneath them, and then they were in the river. If you have not spent time thinking about what it means to be in the Zambezi River, in the water, rather than above it, let us take a moment to think about it together. The river is brown because of suspended sediment, which means visibility in the water is essentially zero. You cannot see your own hands below the surface. You cannot see what is underneath you. You cannot see what is beside you. You feel the current, which in this stretch is moderate but persistent, pulling downstream. You feel the water temperature, which is warm, significantly warmer than anything a European tourist would have encountered in a river before. And you feel, or your nervous system begins generating, a very specific kind of awareness of what you know to be in this water with you. The hippo that overturned the boat did not immediately leave. This is the part of the story that separates it from simpler, more straightforwardly horrifying accounts of hippo attacks. In many documented hippo attacks on boats, the animal makes contact, the boat sinks or overturns, and then the animal departs. The confrontation is over. The danger, such as it is, was in the moment of impact. What comes after is the scramble to shore, the assessment of injuries, the emergency response. This was different. The male stayed. He was observed surfacing within meters of the people in the water, multiple times during the 40-minute period. He submerged and resurfaced. He charged at least twice more at individuals in the water, charges that witnesses described as fast partial rushes that stopped or veered before contact. One survivor described being pushed bodily sideways by the pressure wave from a submerged animal moving very close to them. Whether that was the same male or a different animal from the pod that had been resting downstream is something that cannot be definitively established. The guide, who landed in the water near the overturned hull of the boat, did several things immediately. He called out to the group in a calm and deliberate voice. He directed them to move toward the hull, which was still floating inverted, and to get as much of their bodies out of the water as possible by gripping the upturned bottom. He counted people. He kept counting people. He continued calling out in a calm voice, even as the animal circled. This is not a trivial thing to do. The psychological literature on acute stress response is clear that in situations of extreme threat, The human nervous system tends toward one of two states, both of which are largely incompatible with clear rational communication. The ability to maintain verbal coherence and perform deliberate cognitive tasks like counting and directing while in the water on a flipped boat in the presence of an agitated hippopotamus, and almost certainly knowing that there are crocodiles in this river, is a form of performance under pressure that very few people have been tested on. Not everyone made it to the hull immediately. Two tourists drifted some distance downstream in the confusion of the overturn. One of them, a woman who had been sitting at the front of the boat and was thrown forward and outward, described later being completely disoriented when she surfaced, not knowing which direction was the bank, not knowing where the other people were, hearing shouting but unable to determine its source or meaning. She swam. She later said she swam without any clear sense of direction, simply because staying still was not something her body was willing to do. She reached the hull because she heard the guide's voice and swam toward it. The other person who drifted was a man who had been struck by some part of the boat, or its contents during the overturn, and was dazed when he entered the water. Other survivors later reported seeing him floating face up and not moving decisively. Two members of the group, both of whom had managed to get partially onto the hull, went back into the water and brought him to the boat. Let us pause on that for a moment. Two people voluntarily re-entered the water in which a hippo was actively circling in order to bring another person to safety. This happened. This is documented. These were not trained rescue personnel. These were tourists on a wildlife viewing trip who had been in the water for perhaps 5 minutes at that point. Understanding why the hippo behaved the way it did across those 40 minutes requires understanding something about hippopotamus territorial behavior that is genuinely counterintuitive if your mental model of these animals comes primarily from zoo visits or wildlife documentaries focused on their more photogenic habits. The Hippopotamus amphibius, is not a predator. It is an obligate herbivore, spending its nights on land, grazing on grasses, and returning to the water before dawn. Its teeth, those enormous ivory-bearing lower canines that can reach lengths of 50 centimeters in older males, are not feeding instruments. They are weapons, entirely weapons. They have evolved purely for combat between males, for the assertion of territorial dominance, for the defense of space in the water and of females within that space. The social structure of a hippopotamus pod is organized around a dominant male who controls a stretch of river. This territory is not enormous by the standards of some African megafauna. A dominant bull's territory on a river may span 200 to 500 meters of waterway. Within that stretch, he maintains exclusive mating rights with the females in the group. Younger subordinate males are tolerated at the margins, and bachelor males exist in their own groupings at the territorial boundaries, engaged in a more or less constant low-level competition for eventual access to territories of their own. The dominant male defends this territory aggressively and continuously. He marks it with dung scattered by his rotating tail, the distinctive behavior that visitors to any zoo with hippos will recognize. He engages in threat displays, the enormous yawning gape that exposes the full length of those canines, the territorial honking and grumbling that travels across the water at night. He challenges any male that enters his stretch. And he challenges boats. Not because he has evolved to perceive boats as a specific threat. Boats are not in his evolutionary history, but a large floating object entering his territory, moving through his space, potentially separating him from females, potentially representing a rival, triggers the same response that another large male would trigger. Assessment, threat display, escalation, contact. The territorial nature of the male is also the reason he did not immediately leave after overturning the boat. The boat had come into his territory. The territory was still his territory. The fact that the boat was now upside down and the people from it were in the water did not fundamentally change the territorial calculus from his perspective. The intruders were still in his space. He continued to monitor them, to assert his presence, to communicate in the only language available to him that this was his river and they should not be here. The guides in the region who deal with this kind of incident have a protocol for what to do when you are in the water with an agitated territorial hippo. Stay as still as possible. Do not splash. Do not make high-pitched sounds. Do not attempt to swim away in a visible panicked rush, because movement and noise attract the animal's attention and may trigger a charge. Attempt to increase your distance from the animal slowly and quietly, using the current where possible rather than active swimming. Get vertical cover between you and the animal if you can. A hull, a rock, anything. The guide applied this protocol. He applied it while managing 11 other people, some of whom were injured, one of whom was dazed and partially incapacitated, all of whom were experiencing levels of fear that are difficult to describe without having been in the situation. The 40-minute period was not uniformly the same. It had phases. The first phase, roughly the first 10 minutes, was the most acutely dangerous. The animal was highly agitated. His approaches were close. The group was fragmented, not yet organized around the hull. The guide was simultaneously assessing injuries, directing people, and tracking the animal. The second phase, from roughly 10 minutes to 25 minutes, was the guide working to move the group with the current, very slowly, millimeter by millimeter of quiet drift, toward a shallower area with riverine vegetation that might offer some cover and might also be less central to the male's territory. During this period, the animal surfaced regularly, but the charges, if you could call them charges, were less directed. The guide interpreted this as the animal moving into a threat display mode rather than an attack mode. Not because the danger was over, but because the character of the behavior had shifted. Less forward aggression, more visible presence, more territorial assertion. The third phase, from roughly 25 minutes to 40 minutes, was the waiting. The guide had maneuvered the group to the margin of the channel. There was a submerged sandbar beneath their feet, just barely within standing depth for the adults. People were standing, holding each other, holding the hull. The animal was still present, but had increased its distance somewhat. The guide was assessing the bank, assessing the vegetation, calculating the risk of a final push to shore against the risk of remaining in the water. It was another boat that ended it. A second vessel from the same operator, which had set out from the dock when the first boat failed to make radio contact on schedule, came around the upstream bend and found them. The driver of the second boat, seeing the situation, made the decision to bring his vessel between the group and the area where the hippo was last observed, creating a barrier, an interruption, a break in the territorial calculation. The group got out of the water. 3 people required immediate medical attention. One had a significant laceration from contact with part of the boat structure during the overturn. One had what was later confirmed as 2 broken ribs, also from the initial impact and capsize. One was being treated for shock, severe enough that she was not fully responsive. None of the injuries were from the hippo directly. The animal had not actually made contact with any human body during the 40 minutes in the water. The injuries were all from the overturn itself. This is not as surprising as it might initially seem, and understanding why requires going a bit deeper into what a hippo actually does when it attacks versus what it does when it threatens. A full attack by a hippopotamus is one of the most catastrophic things that can happen to a human body. The bite force of a large male has been measured at approximately 1,800 pounds per square inch. For context, a lion's bite force is approximately 600 pounds per square inch. A large saltwater crocodile, which has one of the most powerful bites of any living animal, clocks in at around 3,700 pounds per square inch in the largest individuals. The hippo sits between those two numbers, and unlike the crocodile, it does not simply bite and hold. The lower canines, those massive curved ivory weapons, inflict puncture and crushing injuries simultaneously. When a hippo attacks a boat with intent, with full commitment, the boat does not simply overturn. The hull is breached, the hull is bitten. People have survived hippo attacks and required surgical procedures to address the consequences of those bite forces applied to the human thorax or the human limb. None of that happened here. The male came up under the boat, upended it, and then entered what appears to have been a territorial assertion and maintenance behavior rather than a pursuit and kill sequence. He did not bite people. He did not attempt to bite people. He communicated with great effectiveness that they were in his territory, and he was unhappy about it. This is the distinction that guides who work with hippos spend careers learning to read. The difference between an animal that is in the process of killing you and an animal that is in the process of telling you to leave. The difference between those two things can look, from the perspective of someone in the water without that expertise, essentially identical, which is why having a guide who can read the difference is not a nice to have on a wildlife river. It is the thing that determines outcomes. The hippopotamus is classified by the International Union for Conservation of Nature as vulnerable. Not endangered, but vulnerable, meaning the population trend is declining and the pressures on that population are significant and continuing. The main pressures are habitat loss as agriculture expands into floodplains and river margins, the degradation of grazing land, direct conflict with humans as hippo and human populations increasingly share the same geography, and poaching for the ivory trade. The relationship between hippos and people in sub-Saharan Africa is one of the most complicated and consequential human-wildlife relationships on the continent. In the regions where the Zambezi and its tributaries support large hippo populations, the animal is simultaneously a resource, in the sense that it drives substantial wildlife tourism revenue, and a genuine threat to human life and livelihood. Hippos come out of the water at night to graze. They consume enormous quantities of vegetation, up to 35 kilograms per night in a large adult. In subsistence farming communities along river margins, a pod of hippos working its way through agricultural fields represents not an inconvenience, but a catastrophic food security event. And when people die from hippo attacks, which they do, in significant numbers, in communities along these rivers every year, the death is rarely a tourist on a wildlife boat. The deaths are fishermen, on dugout canoes, who have entered the wrong stretch of river at the wrong time. They are children who have gone to fetch water from the river before dawn. They are people who encounter hippos that have come inland to graze and are now caught between the animal and the water, which is always the most dangerous place to be in a hippo encounter on land. The animal will go through a person standing between it and the river without hesitation, because returning to the water is the overriding imperative when it is threatened on land. The statistics on hippopotamus attacks are genuinely difficult to compile for exactly this reason. They are not centrally reported. They occur in remote areas with limited communication infrastructure. The deaths are known within communities and to local health facilities, but often do not reach regional or national reporting systems, let alone international databases. Estimates of annual hippo-related human fatalities in Africa range from several hundred to over 500 per year, but the honest answer is that nobody knows with confidence. What is known is that for the communities living along rivers like the lower Zambezi, the hippo is not an abstract conservation concern. It is a neighbor, a dangerous, unpredictable, genuinely lethal neighbor that also, paradoxically, is one of the most significant ecological engineers in the river system and is therefore essential to the health of the very ecosystem that those communities depend on for water, fish, and agricultural fertility. The ecological role of the hippopotamus in an African river system is one of the more remarkable examples of how a single large animal can shape an entire ecosystem. Hippos are sometimes described as ecosystem engineers, a term applied to species whose activity physically modifies the environment in ways that affect many other species. The mechanism is straightforward and slightly strange. Hippos spend the day in the water and come out at night to graze on land. This means that the nutrients they consume on land, the grasses and other vegetation, get transported into the river system through their excretions when they return to the water. The vast quantities of nutrient-rich waste that a pod of hippos deposits into a river effectively fertilizes the aquatic ecosystem, driving algae growth, which drives invertebrate populations, which drives fish populations. A study published in the journal Science found that in rivers and lakes where hippo populations had been removed, fish populations declined, not just locally, downstream, because the nutrient input that the hippos had been providing was no longer entering the system. The hippos were feeding the river from inside the river, and this was not a subtle effect. The authors of the study were able to trace the isotopic signature of the nutrients from hippo dung through the aquatic food web, showing that in some stretches of river, a significant proportion of the carbon in fish tissue was ultimately derived from terrestrial grasses that had passed through a hippopotamus. The hippo is also a channel engineer. The pathways that pods of hippos create moving between water and land become drainage channels during floods, modifying the floodplain in ways that affect which species can colonize which areas. Their movement through shallow water and along river margins modifies the physical structure of the riverbed and the bank. Remove the hippos, and the river is different. Not immediately, not visibly in the way that a dam or a diversion makes a river different, but measurably, ecologically, fundamentally different. The ecosystem has lost one of the inputs that made it what it is. This creates a genuine conservation complexity that goes beyond the simple metrics of population size. A hippo is not just a large charismatic megafauna that tourists pay to see on river trips. It is a functional component of the ecosystem, and its loss has downstream consequences, literally, that extend far beyond the boundaries of its territory. The people on the boat that morning were aware of none of this in any operational sense as they clung to the upturned hull in the brown water. What they were aware of was the sound of the animal. Several survivors independently described the sound as the dominant sensory memory of the experience, more than the visual. more than the physical sensation of the water. The honking grumble of the hippo, that distinctive resonant call that falls somewhere between a snort and a roar and a foghorn, heard from the surface of the water rather than from the safety of a boat, is an entirely different experience from hearing it recorded or described. One survivor, speaking to wildlife officials in the days after the incident, said it felt like the sound was inside the water, like it was transmitted through the water into her body, rather than arriving through the air. This is not far from physiologically accurate. Hippopotamus vocalizations occur partly above and partly below the surface simultaneously, a feature of hippo communication that researchers have studied extensively. The animal can synchronize its above-water and below-water calls. The below-water component travels faster and further than the above-water component. Other hippos receive both versions at slightly different times, because the below-water sound reaches their submerged bodies before the above-water sound reaches their ears. This might function as a range-finding or directional mechanism within the pod. For a person floating at the surface of the river, the below-water component of that call arrives not through the air, but through the water, through the body, as a physical vibration rather than an auditory event in the conventional sense. It is something you feel rather than hear. And the thing you feel is not possible to mistake for anything other than what it is. The guide gave his account to wildlife officials, and subsequently to journalists from regional media outlets. His description of the 40 minutes was careful and detailed. He described the animal's behavior in terms that reflected extensive experience with hippo aggression. He noted that at no point did he believe the male had committed to a full attack posture after the initial capsize. He described the animal as highly agitated and territorial, but not as pursuing a hunt sequence. He said that the presence of the second boat, arriving when it did and positioning itself as it did, provided the break in the territorial pressure that allowed the group to exit the water. He also said something that received less attention in subsequent coverage of the incident. He said he had been watching the pod in that section of river for several months before the incident and had identified the male as an animal with an unusually small territorial buffer zone, meaning the distance at which he became agitated by the presence of a boat was significantly smaller than the average for dominant males in the area. He had communicated this observation to other guides in the operation. He had logged it. He had recommended that boats give that stretch of river a wider berth than usual. What happened on the morning of the incident was that weather conditions, specifically a strong upstream wind, had caused a navigational deviation that brought the boat closer to the center of the channel than the planned route. The planned route would have taken them along the far bank, outside what he estimated as the male's territorial range. The deviation brought them within it. This is the thing about wildlife incidents that requires careful thought when we try to understand them, rather than simply witness them. They almost never result from a single failure or a single unlikely event. They result from a sequence of individually small deviations from a safe baseline, each of which might have been tolerated independently, but which combined to produce an outcome. The wind was not unusual. The navigational adjustment in response to the wind was not unreasonable. The fact that the adjustment brought them closer to the center of the channel was an incremental drift rather than a sharp deviation. The fact that this particular male had a smaller territorial buffer than average was known, but had not yet been formalized into a route change. The fact that the male was in a particularly agitated state that morning, possibly due to the presence of a rival male at the downstream boundary of his territory, was not knowable from the boat in advance. Any one of those factors removed from the sequence and the boat passes through. All of them together and the boat goes over. The surviving group spent several days in the area before returning to their respective countries. Wildlife officials conducted an assessment of the incident. There were discussions about route modifications in that section of the river. The guide was given time away from operations. The boat, or what remained of it, was recovered and examined. The male hippo was not located, identified with certainty, or harmed. He remained in his territory. He was there before the incident, and he was there after it. The river was his. Whatever calculus he had applied that morning, whatever had brought him from the bottom of that channel to the underside of that hull, resolved itself the way these things resolve themselves in the natural world, without reference to how human beings feel about the outcome. Life on the Zambezi continued. The next morning, before dawn, hippos came out of the water and moved through the riverine vegetation to their grazing grounds, the same way they had been doing for 4 million years. The herons stood motionless in the shallows. The crocodiles opened their mouths to the cooling air. The fish eagle perched above the waterline and waited for movement below the surface. The river was calm, flat, brown, and still, patient. 40 million years ago, the ancestor of the modern hippopotamus diverged from the same lineage that produced whales and dolphins. This is not a metaphor. It is phylogeny. The hippopotamus and the blue whale share a common ancestor more recently than either shares one with a horse or a cow. The closest living relatives of the hippo are cetaceans, the ocean-going mammals, and studying the hippopotamus today you can see, if you know what to look for, the traces of that aquatic inheritance. The hippo's skin secretes a reddish fluid that was historically described as blood sweat, because it appears when the animal is out of the water and looks, to a casual observer, like the animal is sweating blood. It is not blood, and it is not sweat. It is a unique biochemical compound that functions simultaneously as a sunscreen, an antimicrobial agent, and possibly a thermoregulator. No other animal on Earth produces a compound like it. It is one of the markers of the hippo's deep evolutionary distinctiveness, an animal that has been on its own lineage for long enough to develop solutions to biological problems that are found nowhere else in nature. The hippo's eyes, ears, and nostrils are positioned high on its skull, all roughly on the same horizontal plane, in the way that aquatic mammals tend to position the sensory organs that need to break the surface to function. This allows the animal to be essentially invisible, with almost no profile above the water, while remaining fully aware of what is happening above the surface and fully capable of breathing, seeing, and hearing. The female hippopotamus gives birth in the water. This is unusual for a large terrestrial mammal. The calf must reach the surface to breathe within a few seconds of birth, and the mother assists it. The bond between a hippo cow and her calf is intensely protective, more so than many of the large herbivores that graze alongside the hippo on the African savanna. A hippo cow with a young calf near a watercraft is by most accounts more reliably dangerous than a territorial bull, because the protective response is absolute and immediate rather than territorial and contextual. The animal in the incident on the Zambezi was a territorial male, but the presence of a female with a calf in the pod that the tourists had been watching from the boat, the pod on the far bank that they had been looking at when the male came up from below, means that the protective dynamics of the full pod were in play. It is possible that the male's extreme agitation was not purely territorial. It is possible that the boat's proximity to the females with young calves, perceived from the male's underwater perspective as an incursion toward vulnerable group members rather than simply toward his territorial space, contributed to the severity of the initial response. These things are not fully separable in hippo behavior. Territory and social structure and reproduction and protection of young are all bound together in the behavioral system of this animal. A boat in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the wrong stretch of water, is not just in a territory. It is in a society, and that society has rules, enforced at a speed and with a force that makes the rules of human societies look theoretical. The river tourism industry along the lower Zambezi and in similar hippo-rich waterways across Africa generates substantial revenue. The wildlife viewing experience that rivers like the Zambezi provide, the elephants and buffalo at the water's edge, the extraordinary bird life, the crocodiles, the hippos themselves, draws visitors from across the world and provides income to local communities and national economies that are real and significant. This revenue creates economic incentives to protect the ecosystems that generate it, the same incentives that operate in the coral reef ecosystems of the Pacific, where a living shark on a reef can generate tourist revenue for years, while a dead shark generates a single payment for its fin. The living animal is more valuable than the dead one if you build the economic system correctly. But the economics of wildlife tourism also create pressure, the pressure to get closer, the pressure to give visitors the experience they traveled for and paid for, the pressure to push the route a little further into the territory, to linger a little longer at the pod, to wait for the animal to surface rather than moving on when the comfortable distance has been compressed. This pressure is not always conscious. It is often structural, built into the expectations that travelers bring with them and the commercial incentives that operators navigate. And on any given morning, on any given stretch of river, the difference between the experience of a lifetime and 40 minutes in the water can be a matter of meters. The guide who managed the group through those 40 minutes understood this. He had understood it for years, in the way that people who work very close to genuinely dangerous animals for a long time come to understand it. Not as an abstract risk to be managed, but as a constant calibration, a running calculation that never stops, an attention that never fully relaxes, even when everything looks calm. Especially when everything looks calm. The water was calm that morning. flat, brown, and still, and underneath it, unseen, working through the physics of its world in ways that 4 million years of evolution had prepared it for, and 4 million years of evolution had not prepared the people in the boat to perceive, the animal went about its business. It had a territory. It had females to protect. It had a calf, perhaps somewhere in the margins of the pod. It had the river, which was its sea, and had been its for longer than the concept of ownership exists. The boat came in. The boat went over. The animal stayed. And then, eventually, the second boat came around the bend, and the people got out of the water, and the animal turned back to its territory, and the river closed over all of it and became flat and brown and still again. 3 people were treated for injuries. All of them recovered. The guide returned to the river. The territory is still there. The animal is still there. On a different morning, in a different season, another boat will drift down that stretch of the Zambezi, and the guide in that boat will watch the water very carefully and will make good decisions, and it will be fine. A heron will stand in the shallows. A fish eagle will spiral upward from a dead tree. The hippos will watch from the water, those gray boulders, barely present, just the ears and the eyes and the nostrils breaking the surface. The tourists will take photographs. They will lean toward the water. They will feel the particular excitement that comes from being very close to something real, something that does not know or care, that they are there to appreciate it, something that exists entirely on its own terms and will continue to do so long after every camera has been packed away and every flight has landed and every memory has faded into the comfortable distance of a story told at dinner. This is what wildlife is, not a performance, not a spectacle.